Before a man could think about tomorrow, he had to get through the cold of tonight. After 1929, when work vanished from towns like smoke through broken boards, thousands of Americans found themselves walking roads they had never meant to travel, riding freight trains they had once only watched from a distance, sleeping near tracks, under bridges, beside dry creek beds, and in rough camps where no one asked too many questions because everyone already knew the answer. Hunger did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly, one missed wage at a time, one sold coat, one empty cupboard, one letter from home that said there was nothing left to send. And when a man had no kitchen, no table, no stove, and no woman or mother waiting with supper, a dented tin can could become the last small border between living and giving up. 25. Tin can potato soup. It was hardly soup in the way a comfortable household would have understood the word. It was water darkened by smoke, a potato cut thin so it seemed like more than it was, a pinch of salt if luck had followed the man that day, and perhaps a scrap of onion dropped in with the care of something precious. But when it boiled over a low fire, when steam rose into a cold evening and warmed a man's face, it became more than water and starch. It became the memory of a kitchen. It became the smell of a mother's pot, even if the pot was now a tomato can with the label burned away. For many poor travelers, potatoes were not merely food. They were weight, comfort, and mercy. They could be carried in a sack, traded, begged from a back door, or picked from a field after harvest. One potato, sliced into enough water, could fool the stomach for a little while. And sometimes, in those years, a little while was all a person asked of life. 24. Railroad onion broth. There were nights when a man had no potato at all, only an onion softening in his pocket, its skin brittle as old paper. He might have gotten it from a farmer's crate, a market stall after closing, or a woman who did not have much but could not bear to send him away empty-handed. Dropped into boiling water, an onion gave up its sharpness slowly, turning the water pale and sweet, filling the air with a smell that suggested supper, even when supper was barely there. A stale crust could be torn into it, and the bread would swell, making the broth cloudy and thick. No cookbook honored such a meal. No restaurant would have served it. But by the tracks, where men listened for the low iron cry of a train, onion broth could steady trembling hands and quiet the ache long enough for sleep to come. It was a poor man's warmth, and warmth itself could feel like grace. 23. Cinder beans. Beans were patient food. They did not spoil quickly, did not demand gentleness, did not ask for cream, sugar, or skill. They could ride in a sack for miles and wait until there was water, flame, and time. In the camps that men called jungles, beans often sat near the coals for hours, blackened pots resting in ash, the water slowly thickening while smoke clung to coats and faces. They were hard at first, almost stubborn, as if refusing to soften in a world that had already become too hard. But hunger taught patience. A man could sit beside beans and mend a sock, sharpen a knife, listen to another man speak of Kansas, Ohio, Georgia, or a wife he had not seen since spring. When the beans finally yielded, they gave the body what it needed most, heaviness, strength, something that remained after swallowing. Cinder beans were not only cooked over coals. They tasted of them, of burnt wood, dust, tin, and waiting. 22. Campfire cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was one of those humble things that could seem almost invisible until everything else was gone. Mixed with water and stirred over a small fire, it became mush, plain and thick, clinging to the spoon and the sides of the can. It had no elegance, but elegance had no place beside a railroad embankment in the first cruel years of the Depression. Cornmeal mush filled the hollow places. It settled into the stomach like wet earth, heavy enough to make a man believe he had eaten more than he had. If there was molasses, it became sweet. If there was grease, it became rich. If there was nothing, it still became food. Older Americans had known cornmeal in farm kitchens, mining camps, logging camps, and frontier cabins long before 1929. But on the road, it lost any trace of comfort and became survival itself. A man ate it slowly because there was no second bowl waiting. 21. Ash-roasted potatoes. Sometimes the best kitchen was not a kitchen at all, but a bed of coals covered with gray ash. A potato could be buried there whole, left to blacken on the outside, while the inside turned soft, white, and steaming. There was a kind of old-world wisdom in it, older than the Depression, older than the railroads, older than the cities that had suddenly stopped hiring. No pan was needed, no oil, no clean dish, only fire, earth, and patience. When the potato was pulled from the ash, a man might crack it open with his fingers, burning himself because hunger made him careless. He might scrape away the char and eat the flesh plain, or touch it with salt saved in a twist of paper. It was a meal so simple it seemed almost beneath memory. Yet, for someone alone in the dark, it could feel like being allowed to remain alive one more night. But not every meal came from what a man could carry or cook for himself. Some came from the hands of strangers, and those meals carried another taste entirely, the taste of gratitude, shame, and the long silence of a breadline. 20. Soup kitchen bread and broth. In the towns, hunger stood in lines. It wrapped itself in patched coats, lowered its eyes, and waited outside church basements, missions, union halls, and makeshift kitchens where volunteers tried to stretch a pot beyond all reason. A bowl of broth and a piece of bread could mean the difference between walking on and folding down against a wall. The broth might have held cabbage, beans, bones, onion, or only the faded memory of vegetables. But it was hot, and heat had its own language. During the Depression, writers and relief workers often described the bread line not simply as a place of feeding, but as a place where pride was quietly broken and quietly preserved at the same time. Men who had once worked farms, factories, shops, and rail yards stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending not to notice one another's hunger. They took the bowl, ate slowly, and stepped away before anyone could read too much in their faces. 19. Coffee and donut supper. There were evenings when supper was not supper at all, but black coffee in a chipped cup and a donut gone slightly hard around the edges. It sounds almost cheerful now, the kind of thing a person might buy in a warm shop before work. But on the road, it could be a bitter little mercy. Coffee kept the body awake when sleep was dangerous, when a man had to watch his bundle, listen for police, or wait for a freight train moving slow enough to catch. The donut gave sugar and flour, a brief lift, a small deception of fullness. Some missions and relief lines served meals like this because they were cheap, quick, and possible. A hungry man might hold the cup in both hands long after it was empty, stealing warmth from it, as if warmth could be saved. And in that moment, the meal was not about taste. It was about not being alone in the cold for 10 more minutes. 18. Backdoor sandwich. Before the Depression had a language of programs and statistics, it had doors, back doors, kitchen doors, farmhouse doors, doors where a man knocked softly because he did not want to frighten anyone, then stepped back with his cap in his hands. Sometimes he was sent away. Sometimes a dog barked and nothing opened. But sometimes a woman appeared with a sandwich wrapped in paper, or a heel of bread with something tucked inside, boiled potato, cold gravy, a shaving of meat, a smear of drippings, a slice of onion, whatever the household could spare without becoming hungry itself. The backdoor sandwich carried kindness, but it also carried humiliation. A man could eat it walking away, not wanting the giver to see how fast he swallowed. It was charity small enough to fit in one hand and large enough to keep a stranger moving toward the next town. 17. Ketchup sandwich. Some meals survived in memory because they were good. Others survived because they revealed just how little was left. A ketchup sandwich was bread and ketchup, red and sharp against white or brown slices that were often stale before they were eaten. It was sweet, acidic, thin, and almost childish. But there were times when a bottle of ketchup on a counter, in a diner, or near a relief table seemed like the only filling a man could claim without asking for more. Later accounts of Depression-era food often mention strange sandwiches made from condiments, grease, or scraps, not because people loved them, but because hunger changes the meaning of what counts as a meal. A ketchup sandwich was not nourishment in any grand sense. It was a confession pressed between bread. There is nothing else, so this must become enough. 16. Bacon grease bread. If meat was beyond reach, grease still remembered meat. In many poor households and among men traveling alone, bacon grease was saved with almost sacred care, poured into cans, jars, or corners of pans, protected from waste because it carried calories and flavor when both were rare. Spread on bread, it gave salt, fat, and the ghost of breakfast. It softened a hard crust and made the mouth believe for a moment that something richer had been eaten. Bacon grease bread could be taken on the road, eaten beside a ditch, or shared with a man whose hands shook too badly to light his own fire. To modernize, it may seem like desperation. It was. But it was also knowledge, the old household knowledge that nothing useful should be thrown away. Not fat, not peelings, not bones, not water that had boiled vegetables, not even crumbs. Yet charity could not follow a man down every mile of track. Away from towns and kitchen doors, hunger became quieter, and the land itself had to be read like a last, difficult book. 15. Dandelion greens in a can. The poorest men learned to look down, not in shame, though there was enough of that, but toward the roadside, the ditch, the edge of a vacant lot, the strip of green beside a fence where other people saw only weeds. Dandelion leaves were bitter, especially when they grew old. But bitterness was not a reason to turn away from food. Boiled in a can or a battered pot, they softened into something dark and earthy, something that reminded the body there were vitamins in the world, even when there was no money. For a man living too long on bread, beans, and coffee, greens were not decoration. They were medicine without a label. He might eat them with potatoes, fold them into cornmeal mush, or swallow them plain, grimacing at the taste, and grateful all the same. Hunger taught people that the land was not empty just because no one had planted it. 14. Milkweed pod stew. Some foods from the roadside carried both hope and caution. In certain regions, young milkweed pods were remembered as something that could be boiled and eaten by people who knew what they were doing. But this was not knowledge for the careless. The Depression forced many Americans back toward older habits of gathering, yet the wild did not offer itself safely to everyone. A hungry man might hear from another traveler that these pods could be used, that boiling could soften them, that they could bulk out a stew when potatoes were gone. But such meals belonged to local knowledge, to experience, to the careful eye that knew the difference between what could feed a person and what could harm him. That uncertainty itself was part of poverty's cruelty. When the cupboard was empty, even the weeds seemed to ask a question before they gave an answer. 13. Wild onion and potato hash. If a man found wild onion, the whole evening could change. Its smell rose sharp and familiar from the ground, cutting through the odor of smoke, damp wool, and railroad dust. Mixed with chopped potato and fried in a little saved grease, it became a hash with an aroma almost too rich for its ingredients. The onion made the potato taste less lonely. It gave the meal a beginning, a center, something that felt cooked rather than merely boiled. Men who had worked farms or grown up near fields often carried this kind of knowledge quietly, recognizing shoots, roots, and smells that city men might pass by. Around a small fire, wild onion could make strangers turn their heads. For a few minutes, the camp did not smell like hardship. It smelled like supper. 12. Roadside berry bread pudding. Stale bread was not dead bread. It could be broken, soaked, sweetened if there was sugar, softened if there was milk, and revived if a man had berries gathered from a fence line or thicket. Roadside berry bread pudding was not the smooth dessert of a Sunday table. It was rough, sometimes smoky, sometimes sour, made from bruised fruit and hard crusts that would otherwise cut the mouth. But warmed together, the berries bled into the bread, staining it purple or red, giving it a tenderness hunger rarely allowed. Such a meal carried a strange ache, because sweetness always reminded people of better times. A man eating it alone might remember a mother's cobbler, a wife's kitchen, children with stained fingers in summer fields. The taste could comfort him, but it could also hurt. 11. Cattail root cakes. In marshy places, near ponds, rivers, and wet ditches, cattails stood like brown candles in the wind. Some older foraging traditions treated their roots and shoots as useful food, though again, such knowledge depended on place, season, and care. For the hungry, roots meant starch, and starch meant endurance. Grated, pounded, mixed, or cooked into rough cakes in the hands of someone who knew the plant well, cattail could become another way to keep the body moving. But these were not romantic meals gathered in abundance by cheerful wanderers. They were signs of how far people had been pushed, how poverty could drive a person to study mud, water, and reeds with the seriousness others gave to bank ledgers. The road did not forgive ignorance. It rewarded memory, caution, and the old knowledge of those who had learned from land before they learned from books. But even the loneliest traveler sometimes reached a fire where other men were waiting, and there the question changed. It was no longer only what one man could find. It was what 10 hungry strangers could make together. 10. Mulligan Stew. In the hobo jungle, a man might arrive with 1 potato in his pocket and leave having eaten from a pot built by 10 different hungers. Mulligan stew had no fixed recipe, because poverty rarely gave anyone the luxury of repeating himself. One man brought a carrot taken from a field edge. Another had a small onion. Another emptied the last of his beans. Someone else had a heel of bread, a spoonful of grease, a cracked can of tomatoes, a bone with more hope than meat on it. Everything went into the pot, and the pot became a kind of temporary law. The Franklin D. Roosevelt Library has described these hobo jungles as rough settlements along the rail lines, places where men gathered, washed, traded information, and sometimes shared a communal meal. But no archive can fully hold the feeling of that stew, the smoke in the throat, the circle of tired faces, the quiet understanding that every man there was both stranger and neighbor. Mulligan stew tasted different every time, but its meaning stayed the same. It said that even when the country had failed to feed its people, hungry men could still make a table out of dirt, fire, and trust. 9. Beggar's beef and potato pot. Meat changed the sound of a camp. A little beef, even a tough scrap, even a piece mostly gristle, could make men look up from the fire with a kind of guarded hope. It might have come from a butcher's discard, a farm kitchen, a mission, or the generosity of someone who knew what it meant to go without. Cut small and boiled with potatoes, it surrendered slowly, flavoring water that would otherwise have tasted of iron and smoke. The potatoes took on the meat's strength, and the broth darkened into something that felt almost like a real supper. No one expected tenderness. Tenderness belonged to better cuts and better times. What mattered was that the pot carried protein, salt, and the smell of something once connected to a working household. In a world where many men felt themselves becoming invisible, meat in the pot reminded them that the body still had demands, and that those demands deserved answering. 8. Hardtack crumble stew. Dry bread, crackers, and hard biscuits were not pleasant companions, but they traveled well. They could sit in a sack until they became nearly stone, and still they were not useless. Crumbled into stew, they thickened the liquid, stretched the pot, and turned thin broth into something that clung to the ribs. A man might break them with the handle of a knife, or crush them between his palms, letting the fragments fall into beans, tomato water, onion broth, or whatever the camp had managed to gather. There was old military memory in such food, and old frontier memory too. The knowledge that dry grain, once softened, could become a meal again. In the Depression years, when waste felt almost sinful, even the hardest crust had a second life. The stew did not become fine, but it became fuller, and fullness was a kind of peace. 7. Bean and corn skillet. Beans and corn had fed poor tables long before the stock market broke, and they continued feeding the road after so many other things disappeared. Together they were plain but dependable. The beans heavy and earthy, the corn sweet when there was sweetness left in it. Both cheap enough to appear in sacks, cans, or relief boxes. In a skillet, if a skillet could be found, they could be warmed with grease, onion, pepper, or nothing at all. The mixture had a rough American memory in it, crossing farm kitchens, tenant camps, work camps, and railroad fires, without belonging entirely to any one place. Men ate it from tin plates, from cans, from the edge of a knife, not because it delighted them, but because it stayed with them. A meal like that did not promise comfort. It promised distance. Another mile walked, another town reached, another day survived. 6. Tomato macaroni pot. Cheap pasta and tomatoes made a meal that could feed more mouths than seemed possible at first glance. Macaronis swelled in boiling water, tomatoes colored the pot, and a few scraps of meat, beans, or cut-up sausages could make it feel almost abundant. Later memories of Depression cooking often returned to dishes like this under different names, including the well-known Hoover-style stews associated with poverty, relief, and the bitter humor people used when politics had disappointed them. But along the road, the name mattered less than the miracle of expansion. A handful of dry macaroni became a pot. A can of tomatoes became sauce. A little salt became flavor. Around the fire, men watched it thicken and knew that no one would eat enough, but everyone might eat something. And when even the shared pot was gone, survival came down to what a man could carry alone, wrapped in cloth, hidden in a pocket, or saved for the dark stretch between towns. 5. Cold bean mash on bread. The best meal on the road was not always the warmest one. Sometimes it was the one that did not spoil before the next town, the one a man could eat without fire, without stopping, without drawing attention to himself. Leftover beans, mashed with a spoon, a knife handle, or bare fingers, could be spread over bread and carried in paper or cloth until hunger became louder than pride. It was heavy, dull food, the kind that dried at the edges and stuck to the mouth, but it gave strength. A man could eat it sitting on a rail tie, in the shadow of a water tower, or behind a warehouse where no one cared to look. There was no ceremony in it, no steam rising, no shared talk around a pot. Cold bean mash was solitude pressed into bread, the taste of a man moving through a country that had no place ready for him. 4. Cornbread wrapped in cloth. Cornbread could crumble, dry, and harden, but it remained faithful. Wrapped in a scrap of cloth and tucked into a coat or sack, it became a traveler's ration, a piece of home reduced to something that could survive dust, rain, and rough handling. In farm families, cornbread had often been ordinary, almost expected. But on the road, it became precious because it asked for nothing more. It could be eaten with beans, dipped into broth, softened in coffee, or swallowed plain when there was no time to build a fire. Its crumbs gathered in pockets like yellow sand. Its taste carried fields, mills, iron skillets, and kitchens, where people had once eaten because supper was ready, not because hunger had become dangerous. For a man alone, wrapped cornbread was proof that he had thought ahead, that some small part of him still believed in morning. 3. Oatmeal with lard. Oats were plain, cheap, and forgiving. Cooked with water, they became breakfast for people who could no longer afford to name meals by the hour. With lard stirred in, oatmeal changed from thin paste into something richer, heavier, more lasting. The fat shone on the surface and coated the spoon, carrying heat and calories into a body worn down by walking, cold, and bad sleep. Many old accounts of depression food return again and again to the same principle. Stretch what you have, waste nothing, add fat when you can, because fat keeps a working body from collapsing. Oatmeal with lard was not delicate. It was not the kind of food remembered with laughter around a holiday table. But for a man who had been living on coffee and bread, it could feel almost medicinal, a rough protection against the wind. 2. Potato peel fry. There is a particular kind of hunger that makes a person look at what others throw away and see supper. Potato peels, curled and dirty, could be washed, fried in grease, boiled into broth, or mixed with scraps until they became something edible. They were not the potato itself, only the skin and the thin flesh clinging to it. But poverty teaches the hand to save what comfort teaches it to discard. In boarding houses, poor kitchens, camps, and backlots, peelings could mean the difference between an empty pan and a small, salty meal. The taste was earthy, sometimes bitter, sometimes burnt, and always honest. Potato peel fry was one of those foods that revealed the hard edge of survival. It said that hunger had gone past preference, past embarrassment, past the idea that some parts of food were too humble for the plate. 1. Hoover stew, the last pot supper. In the memory of the Depression, few poor meals carry as much bitter humor as the big pot of macaroni, tomatoes, beans, cheap meat, or whatever could be found, and stretched until it fed more people than it should have. People later called versions of it Hoover stew, tying the meal to the anger and disappointment of an age when millions felt abandoned by men in offices far from the breadlines. But whether it was named or unnamed, cooked in a kitchen, mission, camp, or hobo jungle, the meaning was the same. Dry pasta swelled, tomatoes reddened the water, beans thickened it. Cut-up sausages, if there were any, gave the illusion of plenty. Everyone knew it was poor food, but poor food shared from a common pot had its own dignity. It did not erase hunger, it negotiated with it. And when the last spoonful was gone, what remained was not really the recipe. It was the knowledge that human beings had stood at the edge of having nothing and still found ways to make something. They boiled weeds, saved grease, carried cornbread, roasted potatoes in ash, stretched beans with water, and turned strangers into companions for the length of a meal. These forgotten hobo foods should not be remembered as charming relics or quaint old dishes from a harder time. They were the evidence of fear, endurance, shame, generosity, and stubborn life. They belonged to people who slept under smoke-dark skies, woke with stiff hands, listened for trains, and kept moving because stopping felt too much like disappearing. Their meals were rough, but their survival was not small. In every tin can soup, every cold bean sandwich, every communal stew, there remains a quiet lesson from the road. Dignity can live in the poorest bowl, and memory, like fire, survives when someone tends it.